I believe that American society has experienced radicalization, or what I call mutual radicalization. That is, on both sides there has been extremism, and they have radicalized each other. The staircase to terrorism idea is developed in order to emphasize the power of context. That is, it's not the characteristics of the individual that lead to terrorism, but first and foremost, the characteristics of the context. Imagine a building at the center of which there is a staircase, and there are a number of different levels in this building. Everybody begins on the ground floor. For some reasons, some individuals move up to the first floor, then the second floor, then the third floor, and they keep going up. Now, these individuals don't begin on the ground floor thinking of themselves as terrorists, and they're not terrorists at that stage. But like you and I, they think of themselves as wanting to make progress, wanting to have better lives. And some of them, when they're on the first floor, they see their lives as unjust. They see their lives as full of inequalities and full of problems that they can't solve. And some of them decide they'll move up to the first floor. And on the first floor, they're trying to get ahead. And again, justice is a big theme. And they're looking for ways to make improvements. And again, some of them will find that they can't make improvements on that floor, and they're forced to move up. And the staircase model argues that on each floor, there are certain psychological processes that are dominant in behavior. And these psychological processes impact individuals so that some of them move up this staircase until they reach the final floor and they feel compelled to carry out a violent act. The key to the staircase model is the context. There are always individuals with the personality characteristics who could become terrorists. Now, this is very different from saying that anybody could be a terrorist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in any human group, there are some individuals with the potential to become terrorists. And if you set up a context, which I call the staircase to terrorism, if you set up that context, you're going to have some people moving up. And the solution to terrorism is to change the context. At the moment, our solution is to have security forces that look for people who have reached the highest levels of the staircase, and they try to capture them or kill them. But this is really not the best solution, because as long as the context is as it is, you're always going to have some individuals moving up. There are some common characteristics to the individuals who are most likely to become terrorists once you have the staircase. Most of these individuals are male. Most of them are fairly young. We can also find some psychological elements to them. They tend to be categorical thinkers. They tend to be authoritarian in personality. However, there's quite a variation. And there are also different specializations in terrorist networks and specializations in types of terrorists. In a book I wrote on this called From the Terrorist Point of View, I identified 9 different specializations. The specialization that we all know is what I call fodder. Fodder is the terrorist who goes all the way up and kills others and usually gets killed himself. But that is only one type of specialist. There are a number of others. For example, there are networkers. There are financial people. There are individuals who are on the technical side, for example, deal with computing or bombs. So it's not that there is just one type of terrorist and one type of personality. There are those who make terrorism possible for others to conduct. So in discussing the characteristics of the terrorist, we have to be careful not to simplify. There are different types of terrorists. The main point is that if you have this staircase, you're going to get some individuals moving up and there will be terrorist acts. However, at the same time, I would say that the vast majority of our emphasis has been on Islamic terrorism. Whereas actually, if you look at the kinds of radicalizations taking place around the world, if you look particularly at Western countries and who is getting radicalized, it's not just Islamic terrorists, not at all. It is also right-wing nationalists. And this is a movement that is going to grow. And it's going to grow because of the demographics of the world at the moment. We know that we need something like 2.1% annual increase in order for a population to maintain. Now, we don't have that in Europe. We don't have that in North America. We don't have that in a number of places. The solution, of course, historically has been immigration. We lack workers, so we import workers. Traditionally, when you look at migration to North America, for example, the source of these migrants has been European, Russian, Christian. Now, these very countries do not have enough population to maintain their own level. So what do they have to do? They have to rely on non-Christian, non-Western sources. So we go to South America, we go to Asia, we go to Africa. These are peoples who are dissimilar to the Christian, white North Americans and Western Europeans. So what we have now is migration of tens of millions of people who are dissimilar to the host society. And one of the principles of psychology is similarity attraction. We know that when you have large numbers of people arriving who are dissimilar in culture, in religion, in language, in phenotypic characteristics, what we're going to have is a backlash. And the backlash in this case involves radicalization among authoritarian nationalists. There is something common to the characteristics of the people involved in the backlash. They are right-wing authoritarians. We know they are typically categorical thinkers, thinking that the world is black and white. They are ethnocentric. They're intolerant of ambiguity and complex thinking. They tend to be conspiratorial in mindset. So we know some of the characteristics that they have psychologically. But there's another way to look at this, and this alternative view is from an evolutionary perspective. I've discussed something that I call catastrophic evolution. And we can begin by thinking about invasive species. Right now, all over the world, we have the problem of invasive species. For example, in the United States, we have pythons taking over Florida as the top predators. Now, has anything like this happened in the human world? I would argue yes. Look at the devastation of native peoples in Americas. Look at the devastation of native peoples in Australia. The human world has got lots of examples where there is an invasion and the local are basically wiped out. You know, look at Tasmania. What is the reaction of the host? Well, the host reacts by trying to defend. I argue that this kind of catastrophic evolution where you have the clash of two different groups and it's possible that one will wipe out the other, when you have this, you get a reaction, and the reaction is violent and often extreme. If you listen to the rhetoric of the white nationalists in the United States, when they were marching in Virginia, they were shouting, "Jews will not replace us." When they are shouting against the Mexicans coming across the border, they see these Mexicans as a threat to their group. So it's this idea that these other groups are invading us. They see them as invasive, just as we can think about invasive species. So from a long-term evolutionary perspective, we can think of this as a reaction from people who see their own survival under threat. You are defending your group, and if you listen to their rhetoric, it's about the defense of our nation, the defense of our language, the defense of our religion, the defense of our culture, the defense of our values, the defense of our lives. They see their own group as under threat and about to be wiped out. And if you listen to Trump, he often gives the game away when he says things like, well, I'm fine with immigrants from Norway, but I don't want them from these, he used profanity to describe certain countries. So it's obvious that this is a defensive gesture from their perspective. They are defending what they see to be the in-group against dissimilar others. We have to be the hero of the story, and there's a commonality to radicalization in that sense. For example, in '79, when I was back in Iran and Khomeini was there, and initially we had freedom. Women were not forced to wear the hijab. They were active politically. And then you could see the radicals with Khomeini becoming more active. And his rhetoric was about defense. Their rhetoric was about the Americans and the Westerners and their values are invading us. We are being overwhelmed by these Western values, these decadent values. And we want to defend Islam. And the way to defend Islam is to repel these Westerners. So we're going to capture their embassy and we're going to force them out. And we are going to defend our women. First of all, we're going to put them under the hijab because that's defensive. And we're going to defend our territories. It's the same rhetoric from bin Laden. You have to get out of our territory. So it's a defensive posture. And this is what the white nationalists are saying as well. They're saying, you have to get out of our territories. This is our world. You have come and invaded us. This defensive posture is not just a positioning, is not just a strategy. They sincerely feel threatened. It's not that they're doing this as a kind of strategic move to make themselves look better. They sincerely feel threatened. And you can see this in their conspiracies, the conspiracies they have, that behind what's going on, there's a reality, there's hands that are hidden, and those hidden hands are out to get us. Part of this personality is this trait that says, you're out to get me, and I'm going to get you before you get me. We change context by first acknowledging that women and men are not born in a particular way, in a fixed way. We change context by acknowledging that certain Muslim men or certain white working class men are not preordained to be violent radicals. So just by acknowledging that, we make a big breakthrough. The power of context has to be acknowledged in all these different areas. For example, in the United States, there is a lot of attention to ethnicity, but there is very little attention to poverty. So what we get is poor white males looking around and imagining that there are all kinds of people getting breaks ahead of them, that women, that minorities are being given breaks, but nobody is helping them. So we've had a movement in the last 20, 30 years of poor white males radicalizing in the United States and supporting authoritarian leaders such as Donald Trump, who is a potential dictator, supporting him even though it's obvious when you look at it objectively that Trump will do absolutely nothing for them. All he will do is lower taxes for the super rich. But more than that, if we look at the Republican Party and the right wing in the United States, the radicalization has been accentuated through the leadership of Donald Trump. In terms of personality characteristics, I have no doubt he is a potential dictator. He is pathologically narcissistic. He has all the traits that we think about in terms of a dictator. And I believe that January 6th was an attempt, a serious attempt at a coup. Now, the fact that tens of millions of Americans continue to support Trump is a trend that I interpret as a radicalization in the larger American population. So it's not just a fringe movement, it is a major movement. And the United States is not the only country to experience this. We can see authoritarian strongmen coming into power in places like Brazil. We can see backward movement in countries like Turkey, Venezuela, places where, if you look back 30 years ago, they were moving towards democracy, but they've had backward movements. Also, I would add India. I think that Modi is an authoritarian figure who is using the same tactics as authoritarian strongmen in other countries. The tactics of identifying enemies, exaggerating and creating intergroup conflict, exaggerating threats, and these are tactics that are well known used by authoritarians to galvanize support, mobilize people, and strengthen central authority, which is Modi himself. When we continue to highlight differences and exaggerate differences and neglect commonalities, we're putting this emphasis on differences on individuals who have the potential to radicalize. And we're telling them, you are different. You don't belong in the mainstream. You don't have anything in common with the people you're going to attack. That's very important. The idea that I'm going to attack somebody and they have a lot in common with me, as opposed to I'm going to attack somebody and they are very different from me. So this celebration of differences has, I believe, had consequences, particularly for minorities. If you look at studies on violence, the first mechanism in order to enable violent acts against a group is to distance that group, to show them as very different from us. If you look at the classic cases, for example, the Tutsi and the Hutu in Rwanda, what did they do? They called the outgroup cockroaches, vermin. If you look at the terrible situation in the Second World War, when there was enormous persecution of certain groups, how was it done? Well, first you label that group as non-human, as different from your group. And in my perspective, this celebration of differences is playing into that process. It is saying that the outgroup is very different from you, and there's no commonalities here. I'm not saying we shouldn't celebrate differences. I'm saying we shouldn't put that as the only thing we do. We have to give priority to human commonalities. We have to teach children how all human beings are in many important ways the same. That is the key lesson. How we're all the same. All human beings have the same psychological characteristics to a great degree. Radicalization involves a transformation of identity. It involves a change in how the individual thinks about what kind of person they are. This is true at the level of the radical who is becoming a potential violent terrorist. It's also true at the level of the radical who is becoming a supporter of a potential dictator. We can see the process as part of something that leads individuals to feel significant, to feel important, and at the level of terrorism, it means that they feel they are doing something that is changing the world. The idea that I'm going to change the world through my violence. And this also involves white terrorists. It's not just minority terrorists. It's not just Islamic terrorists. People who believe that by setting off that explosion, they're going to bring about a revolution. They're going to bring about some change, some important change in the world. Now, when it comes to leadership, authoritarian leadership, and how that leadership uses this need for significance, I distinguish between two types of freedom. One is detached freedom. That is the freedom that we ordinarily think about in terms of free speech, free movement, independence. But there's also something I call attached freedom. Attached freedom is the kind of freedom some individuals feel being part of a group, being part of the glory of a group. And if you listen carefully to the rhetoric of these potential or actual dictators, the classic being Hitler, his message was, merge yourself into the Third Reich. Merge yourself into this group. Lose yourself here, and I will make us great. My leadership will make us great and free. You will be free and great. And this is the same as the rhetoric of make America great again. Become part of that greatness, and you will be free and you will experience that greatness through the group. And you notice that it is not individual freedom again. It is the collective that becomes important, and merging yourself into that collective. And of course, the collective can only be led by one person, and this one person is the dictator or the potential dictator. Mutual radicalization is when two groups or nations push one another to take increasingly extreme positions that rationally they would not typically take. But mutual radicalization is an irrational process in the sense that individuals are submerged within the collective. Individuals are lost within the collective. Now, it's difficult to understand this and to appreciate it until we bring it down to everyday life. Let me give you an example. At the beginning of COVID, you might have experienced going to supermarkets and finding that certain items, or indeed entire shelves, were missing. They were empty. And I remember talking about this with my neighbors, and individually, being rational, we could all agree that it was silly to rush to the shops and buy up more Kleenex or more this product or that product. Because if everybody did it, there would be a shortage. So individually, we could all rationalize and see that problem. But as part of a collective, what did we do? We rushed to the shops and created more shortages. You can see that in a collective process, the individual gets lost and rationality gets lost. That's what happens when you have this surge of support for the authoritarian leader, and the individual gets lost and gets swept along by the process, just as we rushed during COVID to empty the shops of certain products. The same kind of sweeping collective process is involved in the rise of authoritarian leadership. De-radicalization is a process that doesn't necessarily involve coming down the staircase in exactly the same way that somebody went up. De-radicalization, and particularly when it involves mutual radicalization, has a number of possibilities. But the first step, and the most difficult step, is for people to actually acknowledge and recognize where they are. When we take two groups who have radicalized against one another and are at the extreme levels, it is extremely difficult for them to acknowledge where they are, to actually look at themselves and say, well, I am here. I am hating this other group, and I've done these different destructive acts, and look at me, this is where I am. That's a very difficult step, but it's the most important step. And it's the start of a process of climbing down. Identity is at the heart of radicalization, because radicalization involves a change in how we see ourselves, what kind of a person we see ourselves to be. And this is particularly important for young people because that's when identity is being shaped. So young people, as their identities are being shaped, they're thinking of the kind of person they are, and often they're seeking ways of making themselves significant, of counting for something. And for some of them, they get persuaded that carrying out violent acts is the way to count. I believe one of the universal identity needs that we want to feel positively evaluated, but also to be different in some ways and to be significant, to count in some ways. And that's a human characteristic. It varies a little across cultures, particularly in how you should behave in order to count, in order to be significant. But that is where we can reshape the direction of energies away from aggression and destruction. And that is where we have to work on gender roles in particular. What is it to be a male? What is it to be a female? When people look at themselves, what kind of a person they see themselves as a male, does it have to include high aggression and violence? Well, for some at the moment it does. And that's something that can be transformed. There's a number of things that we need to understand better about radicalization in order to prevent violent terrorism and radical movements of left and right. One is the feeling of threat that is often involved with people feeling they need to radicalize. This feeling that I am under attack, that my group is threatened. That's one factor. A second factor is the push in many societies right now to highlight differences rather than commonalities among humans, to push people into groups and categories and say, you are different from them and they are different from you, and to neglect how human beings have commonalities that are very important. So instead of beginning with differences, we should begin with commonalities. This is important at several levels, one of them being that when somebody is radicalizing and getting into a state where they could harm others, if we exaggerate differences and celebrate differences, we're playing into that process. We're saying the person or the group you want to harm, they're very different from you. You are totally separate from them. Whereas what we should be saying is, you are very similar. All humans are very similar. You have many important commonalities. If you attack them, you're attacking your own group. If you attack them, you are harming your own group. That's the message we should be sending. Whereas the message we are sending is, if you harm them, they're a very different group. We have to intervene. The reason we have to intervene is not just because of terrorism. It's not just because of radical violence. It's because this kind of radicalization is the foundation for dictatorship. It's because these people are going to support the potential dictator. Let me begin by just saying that I'm very interested in what I call political plasticity. The extent and the ways and the speed with which we can change political behavior. And leadership is a great example of an area where I believe political plasticity is very low, that we're not able to change quickly. What do I mean by that? Well, we have had settled life for about 10, 11,000 years now. That is, we've lived in larger settlements, we've accumulated a surplus, we've had agriculture, domesticated animals, and we've had a more complex life through that. If we look at this period, all the major societies have had leaders. And in the vast majority of cases, the leaders have been males, older males. We now have the technology to enable us to make decisions by participation of very large numbers of people. We don't do this. If we look at the major societies we always have one leader who's going to make the crucial decisions, and it's mostly male. For example, going to war. Once George W. Bush, Tony Blair had decided we're going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, we're going to have these invasions, it was very difficult for anybody else to step in and stop the process. Millions of people marched against the wars, but nothing happened. Why is it that we continue with this tradition of having one male leader making these important decisions? In much of the world, it's the same. We've got Xi in China, Modi in India. In Iran, there's something actually in the constitution, velayat faqih, this term that reflects one person will make that decision, and it's always going to be a male. This is an example of what I call low political plasticity, that over thousands of years, we have not been able to change this. And it is important to change. I believe that if we had changes in our leadership systems, there would be fewer wars. Take the example of the Ukraine war at the moment, the invasion of Putin and his military. This is a devastating war, but I believe it would not have happened if we didn't have this dictatorial male dominance in Russia, if we had a different type of leadership. And it's an example again of low political plasticity. Males are higher on aggression than females. And when you look at radicalisation, when you look at violent acts based on radicalisation, males are dominant here. Also, when you look at authoritarianism and dictatorships, dictators in the modern era have all been male. Also, when you look at aggressivity in areas like torture, again, it's male-dominated. That's why I always think of women as the solution. I believe that if we had a world where instead of predominantly males making decisions, we had predominantly females, I think we would be a lot better off. But of course, the aggressivity of males is what's holding us back from this. Rather than thinking, is it the environment or is it hardwired in men? it's better, I think, to conceptualize the interaction between what we're born with and the environment, because the environment sets off, it creates the potential for what is inbuilt to be developed further. I'm convinced that we can have a world where aggression is far lower through having more female leadership. Also, not just at the top level, but at all levels. Also, we can have fewer wars and fewer aggressive, radicalized acts by changing the context, by changing the kinds of heroes and heroines we put forward. So there are a lot of things we can do to change aggressivity, but one of them is to push women forward rather than backward when it comes to leadership. Push women into leadership positions rather than push them out. And this is going to take a long time. We have had a revolution in the United States and quite a long history now, over 200 years of presidents, but not one female in the White House yet. If you look at the private sector, women have made some progress to become CEOs and prominent people in business, but it's really not there yet. We still have a long way to go.